We have lots of empty seats in the front for the people who are still filing in. Feel free to move forward, plenty of space. Right down here. I don't bite. This way. So thanks to everyone who made it back after lunch, much appreciated. And I'm excited to begin introducing our panel for the afternoon. So as I mentioned this morning, we've been thinking a lot about this question of what role academia plays in global health. And we've heard some great stories this morning of some of the great basic science going on in this space. But I thought it would be interesting to bring together some of our local nonprofit and biotech partners who are also collaborating in this space to get their thoughts and opinions about what they've done with academia in the past, what works in those relationships and what doesn't, and how we might continue to build strong collaborations within the Bay Area and beyond. So I think I'll quickly introduce everyone. So Eric Easom is the VP of Neglected Diseases at Anacor Pharmaceuticals in Palo Alto. And Pawnee Sabaya is the head of global drug development for PATH down in South San Francisco. And Tom Dubinsky is the CSO of Aduro Biotech right here in Berkeley, California. So I wanted to kick things off by asking each of our esteemed panelists to tell us a little bit about what their organization does in the global health space, and to maybe give an example of how they've engaged academics in their product development programs. Do you want to start, Eric?
I'm happy to. Thank you for having me. And so I'm with Anacor Pharmaceuticals, and we're a for-profit biotech focused on R&D at this point. We don't have any drugs yet on the market, so it's a bit unusual that we would be focused on or working in neglected diseases, which is part of the interest, I think, of this story. But anyway, our technology is we incorporate the boron atom into small molecule drugs, and we started about 12 years ago. And just to give you a brief background, we screened broadly just to look at the biological effects as we were learning the chemistry, and discovered that we also had drugs that were very effective, I think, against neglected diseases. And so that creates a dilemma in a for-profit company. As you know, you've got this desire, you want to do the right thing and do this, but how do you do it? And so what we ended up doing was coming up with a philosophy that as long as we could raise money from foundations or nonprofit entities to work in this space and not spend shareholder money doing it, that we could pursue that. And so that's a lot of the reason why I came to Anacor, was to kind of head up some of that activity. And so in screening these, you can imagine that a for-profit, we wouldn't have any of the biological expertise that we saw great depth in this morning, and is really essential to any drug discovery program, is to really understand that biology. And so we partnered with a number of academics. I started trying to count them yesterday, but we probably have over 50 academic partners across at least a dozen active drug discovery programs, from malaria to TB to all the trypanosomes and so forth. And so just to give you a quick example, early on some of the screening was done. We've long time partnered 10 years ago with Jim McCarroll's group at UCSF across the other side of the bay. Anyway, they identified activity against trypanosomes, and we ended up getting in vitro and then in vivo data that showed activity against human African trypanosomiasis, and that led to a partnership with Drugs for Neglected Disease Initiative out of Geneva, which is a nonprofit product development partnership that's funded by Gates Foundation and Médecins Sans Frontières and several others. And so anyway, it led to that, and then as an outcome of that collaboration, we now have a drug that's just completing phase 1 clinical trials. It's one of the first ever optimized drug for HAD, I think, in terms of industrial scale optimization that appears to be, if everything works out, has a profile of being a single dose oral drug for both CNS and blood stage HAD. So that's the kind of activity, I think, of bringing kind of the power of biotech and drug discovery and industrial partnerships with academia and combining to be able to do this kind of work. So that's how we operate.
Bonnie?
So good afternoon. So I'm Pony Sabaya, and I'm part of an organization called PATH, and we are a global nonprofit which are focused on bringing solutions both from a technology perspective, but also making sure that whatever is developed is delivered and used in the market. And I lead a group within PATH, which is the Drug Development Group. We're actually based in South San Francisco, and our focus is on, the core focus is on diarrheal diseases. We actually are working on anti-secretory agents that would help address, the severe dehydration that often young children often die from in areas of the world such as Bangladesh. The other area we work on is an HIV PrEP. It's just prevention, exposure prophylaxis. It's to see how can we decrease the risk of someone who has the risk of converting from HIV negative status to HIV positive. Now, as far as academics and how we partner with them, it's actually critical. Partnership with academics, just like Eric said in his organization, is also critical at PATH as well. One particular partnership I'll just mention right now is one that we've had with the University of California, Berkeley, with Professor Jay Kiesling and his group. And that has been a decade-long work. It started actually with Dr. Kiesling's work in the area of malaria to bring about a semi-synthetic supply of artemisinin, which is an important ingredient in malarial treatments. It started about almost 10 years ago based on the cutting-edge work based on synthetic biology that Dr. Kiesling discovered here. And after almost 9 years now, it's actually through various phases, of which PATH, previously called One World Health, was the key project driver of. It's now actually been being produced industrial capacity and is now available commercially. So this is an example of a partnership that can go all the way to commercial production. So I'll stop there and I can comment on some details later.
Great. Tom?
Great. Thanks. So I'm Tom Dubinsky. I work for a small for-profit biotech company in Berkeley known as Aduro Biotech. Of course, for-profit in the context of small biotech is an oxymoron. We're always striving to actually have enough money to do our work. And that actually also sort of, I think, underlines the importance of our academic collaborations. And without going through all of the history, the company Aduro actually has been through several iterations, starting first several years ago at a company called Cirrus, which wanted to kind of diversify its abilities, and the company became very interested in vaccines generally and in cancer immunology. And so just thinking about how we would approach this, we ultimately, through a couple of other contacts, went and met with Dan Portnoy, who you all know, and he's a big part of the meeting here today, mainly to sort of begin to pursue using Listeria as a vaccine platform. And I think this was an ideal sort of intersection between academia and small biotech, because of course in that context, as a small biotech, unlike larger companies like say a Genentech that can do basic discovery research, we cannot. And so thinking about using Listeria as a vaccine platform, there's two obvious aspects that come to mind. One is the attenuation, and secondly, how you express and secrete designated heterologous antigens. And so you can imagine, at least in the context of developing a vaccine strain, you have to understand the basic biology and pathogenesis of Listeria, which of course has been one of the long-term areas of focus of the Portnoy lab. And so it kind of actually represented an ideal situation where understanding the pathogenesis and how that led to, for example, induction of functional T-cell responses that are related to intracellular pathogens in cancer, of course, is that we could have such a nice collaboration back and forth, asking the questions that we did in the context of attenuation and induction of appropriate functional immunity and how that related to pathogenesis. So you can see how that's sort of a necessary collaboration. We're doing things that the Portnoy lab would not be interested in doing, and vice versa. And the other important thing, the other area, so the company's involved in cancer and in infectious disease vaccines. In the past, we've had support from PATH and from the Gates, working on TB, now with Sarah Stanley here, and malaria and HIV. And so those have been very valuable, but this academic collaboration then led us to, again, understanding the pathogenesis of Listeria and how it modulates the interferon response. Ultimately, the Portnoy lab, as you heard in an earlier speaker today, identified that had to do with the small molecule cyclic di-AMP, and that led us to collaborating not only with the Portnoy lab, but Russell Vance's lab, who discovered that CDNs actually bind to and activate STING. And the very direct and obvious questions, can we use these molecules as an adjuvant for recombinant protein-based vaccines? So my point is actually pretty simple, is that, small biotech, of course, would quickly go into irrelevance were it not for the academic collaborations that it establishes. And then once you're in the clinic, it's absolutely required to work with leading investigators. And we work very closely with several from the group at Johns Hopkins who are interested in particular diseases like pancreatic cancer, for example. So.
So I'm going to be asking the speakers a series of questions, but I want this to be an interactive session, and I want people to feel free to raise their hand and interject and also comment and ask questions. We have someone with a microphone who's going to be running around between these questions. But to kick things off, I thought that I would ask you if each of you could give an example of the kind of value that an academic collaborator brings to your projects, and also maybe the areas of your projects that you don't seek out assistance for academic help. I think there's sometimes difficult to distinguish the line between when a project is an academic project versus when it's truly a product development project. Pawnee, would you like to start?
So for our work, where we see the importance of academics is especially in the early stage of development. So, you have right from when you discover the product to taking it right into the market. There's a pretty large bandwidth and different levels of expertise you need during that value chain. And where academics play a critical role is really especially at the front end, which is validating targets in specific diseases, developing assays, which can lead to then discovery of compounds. And where we see, for example, the PDPs playing a role, PDP meaning a product development partnership such as PATH, is really taking then the baton from academics and doing the necessary work so that you will be able to get into the next phases of development. So taking the compound that's discovered, but you have to do a lot of regulatory associated work, such as making sure, are we looking at toxicity? Before you can go into humans, all the necessary work that needs to be done. And we see, for example, PATH's role is really taking that, making sure that it is what's called investigational new drug enabling, and so that the FDA would then approve it, or other regulators, to be able to take it into human trials. And this is where we have the expertise to take the baton and take it through there to approval. And then at PATH, we really look then to partner with a lot of local players on the ground, so drugs that are approved can then be taken up with always a local context in mind. And so that collaboration is critical, and this is where constant communications between what is needed right from the country level, so that it's not, drugs are not developed so that they are kind of pushed down without keeping the local relevance in mind. And this is where I think PATH's role is, because we have our actually affiliates located on the ground. Half of our employees, we're about 1,200 employees, half of them are actually in countries such as Africa, Asia. And so we try to bring those insights not only into the development work we do within PATH, but also sharing that with academics to see, okay, how do we develop so that the drugs at the end of the day are relevant for end users.
Tom, do you have any comments on the value added by academics and the collaboration?
So, again, I think based on what I said earlier, it's unquestionable about what the value is. But I mean, there's a number of other things that maybe we haven't addressed yet. And again, I mostly will speak kind of from the context of a small biotech, and of course, one size doesn't fit all. And of course, and all of us are well aware that in many cases, just, investigators at universities start their own companies. Sometimes they don't, and just, like in the context of our own, like, for example, Dan is one of our scientific founders and of course, very close scientific advisor. The other thing, of course, is depending on what the disease area is or what technology platforms are, it's always very difficult to have hire scientists, right, that have the appropriate insights in something that's brand new from a technology perspective, but also maybe are willing to, in the setting of again, a biotech, you might have a great, interesting result, but it might, on the other hand, be completely irrelevant in terms of development getting towards IND, as you mentioned earlier, Pony. So, but my point is that the academic world and collaborators are a great resource actually for scientists. And in fact, in our own company, we have several investigators are from labs at UC Berkeley because we're developing the platforms that they worked with during their postdoc or PhD. The other important point, and this hasn't been raised yet, is of course is intellectual property. And typically, if you want to get into a new technology that becomes a very hot area, having sort of the early being able to license patents or patent applications at a very early stage is absolutely essential to have that period of exclusivity where you can actually find whether or not this technology is in fact applicable to a number of different commercial applications, or in the context of like Gates-funded programs, they have reached through it, but they'll of course support that product development work. And from the context, this is really where companies, I think, help academic institutions, because it's very inexpensive, of course, to apply for a patent, but it's really the prosecution and expansion throughout the world that becomes very expensive, and of course universities can't afford, especially a budget-challenged university like UC Berkeley, unfortunately, to actually actively prosecute all those patents. And so it requires that sort of academic biotech partnership to enable that. And ultimately, that comes back to the university as well for commercially successful products.
Eric, you also already mentioned some of the value added in terms of scientific knowledge and expertise in the disease areas, but is there anything else you'd like to add about the value add from your academic
Yeah, I mean,
partners?
I can say, for our work, they are an essential component of the team. So, we're experts in chemistry and biology, and our company focuses on antimicrobial, kind of bacterial, fungi, and also anti-inflammatory. But working, for example, on onchocerciasis, so we're working on the macroflaricide. We know how to do chemistry and design molecules, and we know how to do PK and these kind of things, but on the biology front, it makes absolutely zero sense for us to build that capability in a for-profit company. And so I can see Judy Sakinari and the team in the back from UCSF. They do the screening, so they're doing the frontline in vitro screening. They work on a lot of the in vivo work with us. Fidelis, who's I think going to speak in a minute, in Cameroon. So these are complex arrangements, but he's in Cameroon. He's doing Owochengi screening against adults. He does Loa cross screening to make sure we can have a compound that works in those. So they're an active part of our team providing the biology expertise to allow that. And that's the same in malaria, tuberculosis, all the areas we work at. We don't have any of the biology expertise that we would for a commercial application. It just makes no sense. And so they're an integral part of our team instead of Anacor employees. So that's how.
I think following on this, I'm wondering if you guys could each talk about a challenge of working with academic partners, because I think you've been very kind and how great everyone in academia is. But it would be great to hear also what some of the challenges and sticking points of those relationships have been, and maybe how you've worked to address or overcome those when possible.
I'm happy to
Want to
start.
start?
You want to? Yeah, I mean, I can say there are none. No, I mean, I think, our goal, and I think the academics partners' goal is to create a drug. I mean, generally when we're involved, it's how do we, in an industrial fashion of high throughput screening, have rapid turnaround on assays and so forth, and so the goal overall is to find a drug. Academia, I think, has goals that are slightly different, and that's where the conflicts potentially lie. For example, you have to publish or you perish, or it's that kind of thing. Or you're interested in the biology, just intellectual curiosity, and so there's a lot of side projects and things that you're interested in. Whereas our single focus, a lot of times, is just what's the IC50? How does that drive chemistry and so forth? So I think you see that where there's different goals, basically, or how you're measured or your performance is judged. Can sometimes get in the way, but of course Judy and their team, we don't have this, but it can occur, and that's why I think, yeah.
Great. I can also add to that. So I do think that every sector and organization has different pressures, incentives. And one of the things we learned in the malaria project was the team that worked on the project actually sat down, which included Berkeley, included a small biotech called Amyris, and then it also included a nonprofit. And they decided, let's just talk very honestly, what are our incentives, what are our goals? Because I think that clear communication is very critical, and that got revisited throughout the project, because that can change depending on what the outcomes are and what the budgetary pressures are. So I think what led to the success of the project was that communication, because there are always going to be pressures. Because as Eric said, I think from the academic pressure, it's to advance the science, and it's to publish. For the nonprofit, it is how can we use the funding that we have in a very efficient manner, because so we want to put the least number of questions in a clinical trial. Well, if we put a lot of measures, it's going to get more expensive, it's going to take longer to get that drug approved. And so sitting down and working through that, and I think one of the other areas that was alluded to earlier was intellectual property. I think that's another area where it's always, we will get to get to a resolution, but it takes patience, and it takes the ability to really understand each other's pressures and to really navigate through that, so that the scientists are working very closely with their legal counterparts, so that it isn't just legal discussing that. So those are some of the things we found that has really helped the partnerships progress and achieve results.
Tom, anything to add?
So I don't really have much to add, although I think my area might be a little bit more in the gray zone from both of yours. So while I agree completely, the ultimate goals, if you will, may be different between industry and academia. On the other hand, there's many of the goals that are similar. Like, for example, again, in the setting of small biotech, it really is a story about always being able to raise enough money so that you can continue to develop whatever your, in this case, a vaccine candidate is, and so then you can actually run the clinical trials. And along that way, publication is actually essential to raise money. Again, when we were starting with a technology that actually had not been well appreciated as a vaccine platform, collaborating with scientists and with Dan Portnoy was essential in terms of a lot of papers came from that. And like other academic investigators, of course, trying to write grants and raise money to support, including through PDP organizations such as yourselves, is essential. So publication is really important, and it also ends up to be important once you get to the clinic, because once people initiate clinical trials, depending what the indication and application is, there's competition, if you will, for patients. And actually having a leading clinical investigator requires, they also have publication pressures. And so, again, the point is pretty simple, that I think while there are certainly discrete goals, and ultimately companies to have clinical success to be able to propagate and continue as a viable entity, there's many, steps along the way that the publication and other things are very important to get together.
It's very clear that all of you have, engaged academia very effectively so far. Have any of you had a collaboration that failed miserably with academia? Not that you can.
Collaboration, right? Sometimes, they kind of guide themselves because the science is great and things go well, and other times, either through, whatever, personality conflicts or bad science or just bad results, you move on.
So of the partners you found, how do you identify your academic partners that you've had? Do they come to you? Do you seek them out when you have a specific question? Or are you pointed to people by someone? How are these relationships sparked?
I can start. I mean, for us, it probably goes both ways. I think, generally, we have initiated it because we have a specific need. Like on TB, we need in vivo expertise, and Colorado State or somebody like this has excellent capabilities in some of these areas. So generally, it's a specific project. Malaria. Phil Rosenthal at UCSF sits in our backyard pretty much. We're in Palo Alto, and so it's a very convenient partnership, and he's also very good. He and his team. So I think they do that. Where they may seek us out more might be in the pursuit of science. Like, what's the mechanism of? We do a lot of phenotypic screening and don't know the targets. Which, by the way, that's another comment I would make. Is oftentimes it's great to know it, but it's not essential. And many drugs have been approved without knowing the target. And so we're wanting to solve the problem of finding a drug for a disease. And so, we'll have academics from time to time come and say, what's the target of your African sleeping sickness drug? And we set up a collaboration. We're happy for them to try to sort through that. So that's where we might get approached more. So, but usually we need capabilities to actually join the team and execute a project to deliver a drug.
Yeah, and in Pat's experience, it's kind of similar. Partnerships could be initiated where we reach out to the partner, or sometimes they would reach out to us. And one thing I wanted to emphasize also is these are academic partnerships, not only in the developed world, and as Eric mentioned earlier, it's so critical for us to have partnerships in the academic sector in the developing world. So it was great to see the next talk in that realm, because for us, like in the diarrheal disease world, we are working in very close partnership with a diarrheal disease research center in Bangladesh. So that has been critical to making sure that the programs that we're designing are really relevant, because they're the ones that really know the populations really well. And so those partnerships, sometimes it's because they're experts in that area that we reach out to them, or sometimes it could be at conferences where we meet people and partnerships get formed. So, but it can go either way. And I also think it's not just academic. Sometimes you end up having sometimes partnerships between the foundation, like the Gates Foundation, and then you can have NIH involved, and you can have academics, and then you can have for-profit, and you can have a private sector. And that's the type of partnership we actually have in the HIV study that I mentioned earlier. And so I think the world of global health is really coming much closer together, and each of these sectors, I feel, are really critical to the success. So I think it's academics and PDPs and private sector, but also very critical, I think more and more is happening, is recognizing the partnerships at the country level.
Great. Tom, any thoughts on
really
how you?
Nothing else to add. It just depends.
Sure. So I think the $1 million question, though, that most people send, and I assume ask you as well, is how are these collaborations funded? Are there multiple funders, single funders? Do you pursue the money? Do the academics pursue the money? Do you give anyone money? And how does the funding pan out?
Why don't I start? So for us as a nonprofit, I would say the funding actually, sometimes you can partner with an academic and apply for the funding together. So in the malaria project I mentioned earlier, One World Health, which was previously the group that we were called that, now we're part of PATH, we had collaborated with Berkeley and submitted the grant proposal together to the Gates Foundation. Other times, for example, the the colleagues that work on diarrheal diseases, they're working with a group at St. Louis University where we are giving them a grant, a sub-grant of the money that we receive from the Gates Foundation. So it can occur in various ways. And as far as funding for our programs, it actually, we try to go through very different sources. It could be private foundations like the Gates Foundation. At PATH, of course, we also get funded by USAID and similar equivalents in other countries like the development aid group in the UK called DFID. And we also look at individual donors, as well as organizations such as Wellcome Trust, which is very focused on purely the science. So, and also governments. There's a lot of governments like the Norwegian government, Swedish government, that are also very interested in global health. So there is a lot of different avenues, and I think in the last 5 years it has been much more challenging, I think, especially with the economic situation. But one of the things we're learning is how do we collaborate better? Because I think that's where I think the funders are also getting together, trying to see how do we more efficiently fund so that the Gates Foundation is funding something and the DFID or USAID doesn't know about it. And then we end up really not maximizing a limited pool of money for global health. So I do see that it's coming together more. Funders are talking more. So I do think that hopefully we'll have better use of money and at the end of the day, bring about products in a much quicker fashion.
Tom, how are the collaborations you work on funded?
Yeah, so that's a sort of a complex answer. I mean, I'll just sort of discuss our own case. And again, as a small company of about 30 people, most of our, I'll just call it venture or private funding, is focused principally on one thing, and that is to advance what's been, for us, a very promising immunotherapy for pancreatic cancer. But I started by saying that, we have lots of collaborations around at least two technology platforms. Again, one is Listeria, where we have a number of different attenuated platforms that we've developed from that, and also cyclic dinucleotides. On the one hand, Listeria is a clinical asset, if you will, and so we can fund some of our collaborations through grants that we get for that program, just because it is clinical and promising. It sort of enables us to get grants to fund early stage research. Historically, we've had, as I said, support like through the CAVD program. We were at Gates, we were part of a larger consortium, but then early stage programs that have a lot of conceptual promise, like cyclic dinucleotides, are preclinical. So it's something that it's much more difficult to get funded by our private investors. And so reaching out with academic investigators, writing grants, and trying to get funding earmarked for those particular programs is a real challenge, and it's something we work on actually every day. So the other thing that I don't think has been raised yet is one thing that companies do is also fund academic investigators. So, in our case, we have a couple of so-called sponsored research. That isn't that we guide that research, of course. That what makes great academic institutions great is the independence. But on the other hand, if you have a very close collaboration, placing money to fund work in that lab that may or may not necessarily be useful to the company is also a way that I think that companies kind of facilitate academic collaborations.
Great. Eric?
Yeah, our funding really comes from a few different places, but from product development partnerships like Pony's One World Health, now PATH. We were funded to do some Shigella work with them, but we get money from Drugs for Neglected Diseases, so all the alphabet soups. MMV, which is medicine for malaria. We've gotten funding from TB Alliance and so forth. So those are all global product development partnerships. So a lot of our money comes from them, and then over time, I think the Gates Foundation, which funds a lot of those groups, has started making some direct investments in for-profit companies. And so we've also received a pretty sizable amount of money to work on tuberculosis and onchocerciasis for them. So, I think we get it, and we've also gotten some from the NIH, and I feel sorry for many of you in this room because that's a very challenging route to take, and especially when you want to try to develop a product. But we get funding for that for some of our malaria work as well. So we're open to get funding from anywhere. Our primary purpose is to create a drug in these areas, and we just have to make sure we cover our costs. So. But we get it from all of those sources. And the academic partners are really, if we didn't have them standing beside us, we wouldn't have a chance because we have to have a biology partner that knows the disease and the biology and can run the assays and do it efficiently. And so they really are an essential part of us putting proposals together, going and pitching these proposals to the funding organizations, and are very critical to that process.
Actually, can I just add a couple of things?
of
I would be
course.
remiss in not mentioning the fact that in a couple of our projects, Big Pharma has been critical. They have actually contributed quite a bit of their own expertise, but also funding, like in our malaria project, in the HIV project, that was Sanofi, this was Janssen Pharmaceuticals. So they're also putting money in to bring about products in global health. The other new development, which is interesting, is the recent grant sources from Japan, the GIT Fund, which is, and this is a similar kind of thing in China as well, where the government of Japan has put money and has indicated that if you're interested in getting funding, you got to make sure you partner with a Japanese company. It could be or institution, it could be academic, it could be private sector, but you collaborate together and you can then apply for funding for a global health problem. So I think they're wanting to play a role in global health, but they also want to make sure that the Japanese institution is involved. And China is doing something similar, working in partnership with the Gates Foundation, but you need to involve a Chinese organization. So I think those are also new models that are emerging that to keep in mind as you explore funding for global health.
I think before I ask any more questions, I keep asking questions, I want to see if the audience has any questions for our panelists. I think we have.
Hi. Is this on? No? Yes? Oh, there it is. I had a question concerning CROs, or contract research organizations. I don't know what the O is. How do you see that playing in when Eric especially talks about using academia for technical resources as in addition to intellectual resources? So do you see CROs pushing out the connections with academia in terms of the fact that you can pay them and they will quickly and efficiently get things done, whereas you have some poor grad student maybe plugging along with this collaboration? Can you just comment on how CROs will fit into this?
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, they run into the same problem. These are diseases that are unprofitable. So generally, CROs don't have these kind of capabilities. So we're still, academics are essential. We use lots of CROs to do chemistry, and it makes the, PK and things like this. But to do the actual biology and understand the biology, I can't see that happening in this area.
Yeah, I mean, only thing to add to that, CROs, of course, are a necessary, component of drug development. But again, you imagine a CRO as being a tox house. There's no reason for a company to establish, all the capabilities to do toxicology studies. That's just something that you contract out. In some cases, regulatory. You already mentioned manufacturing. So there's another aspect of the drug development pathway, but it typically won't supplant that academic investigator just because they don't have the intellectual knowledge, as you point out, that will be useful.
Great.
And plus, they're not invested. That's a huge part of it, right? Is that you have to live and breathe what you want to do.
Great. Do we have more questions from the audience? Back here.
Would collaboration with academic collaborators be facilitated if they were better trained in product development? Not with the idea that they're going to do the development, but that they would understand the full process so be able to better integrate with you. And if that is the case, then what specific training would you suggest for an institution like Berkeley to make available?
Maybe I have. So yes, absolutely, because I think especially the drug development pathway and what are some of the, I guess, quickest way to get from early stage to getting an IND-enabling compound and getting it through clinical trials. I think there's more knowledge on that will help the dialogue. So I definitely agree. So how would one go about doing that? Well, one way could be having opportunities for colleagues from universities to be able to work on participate in meetings, or actually maybe do 6 months within either the private sector or working with PDPs to really understand the process. I think just having a meeting and stuff is, I think just to really understand the process, I think you need to kind of live in it for a little while. So I think that would be one way. The other way is, I think, having academic colleagues do attend more of the drug development meetings, like, there are critical meetings where the FDA is participating and they're giving more guidance about drug development, and having more academic colleagues involved in that may also help to understand the regulations and what may be needed.
I sort of a contrasting, but not really a contrasting view. I mean, unquestionably, one thing you mentioned, Pony, and this is something that we have used. For example, talking in front of the FDA or other regulatory bodies, actually having an academic leader in a particular disease indication is really indispensable for getting regulatory bodies to appreciate, really the gravity of the product that's being proposed. What I think one of the real needs, and I'm just trying to choose the words carefully, that can be better advantageous to the university. So I think one thing, of course, that makes UC Berkeley such a great university, again, is the excellence in the independence of the investigators and thinking about basic science and not necessarily the application. But on the other hand, what's very key in terms of transferring that basic knowledge to developing vaccines or new drugs is a technology transfer. And one impression after having worked with this university for many years from a biotech perspective is that many investigators don't necessarily appreciate the importance of getting, I'll just use the term, inventions filed with the technology transfer office so that new applications get generated. And because, again, ultimately that will result in someone wanting potentially to license that and then develop this technology, which ultimately comes back to the university in the context of royalties and things like that. So what I would argue, which is really important, and I think it's probably changed over certainly the last 25 years I've been in this industry, is that academic investigators are more aware of the commercial applications of some of the outcomes of the work that they've done over the years. And then it's also very important to have effective technology transfer offices that can reach out to university or to the private sector and other pharma and biotech, so they're aware of what is available. It's important.
Great. Do we have any other questions here from the audience? Is there a microphone? Someone's coming.
I've had colleagues experience some interesting phenomena in dealing with the technology transfer office here at Berkeley. Have you had any unusual experiences in licensing from the campus here?
Well, I wouldn't be so stupid to say anything negative. I mean, I've talked with, I think Carol Mamura is the head of the technology transfer, and I've known her for years, and I think she's been very effective. And so it certainly wasn't meaning to imply anything negative. I just, sometimes, as you know, scientists can be very obsessive and passionate about something, and you feel an urgency, right? And so I think, again, an institution like, a great institution like UC Berkeley that is so budget challenged, I would argue that they should invest even more in the technology transfer office, because I think it's a great investment into the university to ultimately bring back dollars that can support, these great programs. And so my point is that really, I think, universities generally should, and in my own experience, I've seen different universities have different levels or different capacities, rather, of technology transfer offices. And my point is a simple one. I think UC Berkeley could invest more, potentially, in their technology transfer office.
You've successfully in-licensed some technology
several
from this
things.
campus?
I mean, we have
Did you
patents that we have licensed from the university, and we've also are on other applications and issued patents where we have inventors from both of our company as well as the university. And then royalties, of course, ultimately are split between the two.
And there weren't terms requiring the company to provide cash up front for the license?
Yes, and you can imagine, though, that everything is empirical, right? And so something that's more of a nascent idea, or it's sort of a watershed new discovery, of course, has no validation as a drug or as a potential component of a drug. And some things are complex, and so you recognize that there's going to be multiple, ultimately, pieces of intellectual property that are related to that drug. I mean, it depends, but the short answer is, yes, of course, things are, there's always an upfront and then sort of milestone-based payments based on success. And frequently, again, around intellectual property, these are pending applications. And so, like everything else, things are more difficult these days to get, issued patents and that sort of thing. And so that can also trigger increased payments.
Yeah, well, my colleague had to just walk away. Small companies just don't have cash to give, large companies can maybe provide a big chunk of cash up front to a university, but
well, so
others.
it's an interesting point. I mean, and it's more of maybe a sort of a different discussion. I'll just say a large company like, Pharma X versus, startup biotech. And I think one of the beauties of, and I think this has come out, I think this has been shown to be the case time and again, is that you have a small biotech that's kind of laser focused on one technology, and the scientists that are there know that they're going to live or die based on the success of that. And I think you get sort of a unique ability in that setting to rapidly advance something into the clinic. So I think it might actually be a better investment in some cases for the university to allow, and that's kind of what drives small biotech. And then on the other hand, you don't have this, exclusivity versus non-exclusivity. So it gives the university the option to put their bets in a couple people's basket, right? Because one group might be a bunch of pretenders and the other group is much more competent, and so they can see what works out best.
We are running out of time, so I just wanted to give everyone the chance to add one more comment from the panel if they have anything else to say regarding the future outlook of engaging academia in your work.
Maybe I will finish, because I just see a lot of hopefully future scientists that are going to be focused on global health. And I will just say that I think it's very exciting times in global health, a lot of need. And so we definitely want a lot of young and bright minds coming to work with us in the global health area.
And I'll just add that I was blown away this morning by the talks, and to me, you're coming up with very elegant biological solutions potentially in the next 10, 20, 30 years that'll solve these. We're brute forcing through phenotypic screening and making hundreds and hundreds and thousands of compounds to try to optimize. And I just, I look forward to screening against really novel, essential targets and things that are coming out of academia. So it's really exciting to me.
Great. Well, thank you so much to our panelists. We really appreciate your time.